What if I told you that the most powerful voice shaping your life isn't the voice of your parents, your teachers, your critics, or even your friends, but your own? Not the one you use in conversation, but the quiet, constant one inside your head, the voice that no one hears but you. Now imagine if for just 3 days you changed the way that voice speaks. Not perfectly, just intentionally. What would happen if, instead of tearing yourself down, you spoke with the same kindness, patience, and honesty you offer the people you care about? Would your life look different? Would you feel different? Let's find out. Let's talk to ourselves like this for 3 days. The inner voice is the constant companion of every human soul. It is not loud, not always articulate, and seldom announced, yet it is unceasing in its commentary. From the moment one wakes to the fading breath of consciousness before sleep, this voice shapes the contours of experience. It is not merely a passive observer, it is an active participant, a translator, a judge, and at times, an architect. When we say reality is what we make of it, we often ignore that the first tool of this making is the voice within. You encounter a challenge, perhaps you fall short of an expectation. Now, what happens in the outer world may be brief. A mistake made, a deadline missed, a conversation that turns sour. But what happens inside, that inner commentary, could last hours or even days. You always do this, it says. You're just not cut out for this. And so begins a narrative, not based on fact, but on tone and repetition. The voice doesn't simply describe what happened, it decides what it meant. And once it decides, the feeling follows. Shame, doubt, fear. These are not born only of events, but of the interpretation whispered by the inner voice. People often think of reality as objective and fixed, yet 10 people can walk through the same forest and come away with 10 different stories. One will speak of danger, another of peace. One will see emptiness, another freedom. The trees were the same, the path unchanged. What varied was the lens, the voice that told them what they were seeing. It's not the events of our lives that define us, but the meaning we assign to them, and that assignment happens through inner speech. The voice inside is not neutral. It has been trained, conditioned over years by parents, teachers, media, friends, enemies. It is shaped by wounds and victories, often echoing things long forgotten. A child once scolded for being too loud may grow up with an inner voice that urges silence, even when they have something important to say. A young person praised only when they achieved may find their inner voice demanding perfection before offering any peace. The tragedy is that the original speaker of these ideas may have vanished, yet their echo remains, internalized and relentless. Yet the inner voice can be changed. Like a wild horse, it may not come to heel at first, but with consistent correction, it can learn a new gait. This is not a matter of hollow affirmations or forced positivity, but of speaking truth to oneself with intention. The truth that you are learning, that effort matters, that failure is not an identity. By choosing words with care, even when no one else will hear them, you begin to change the shape of your world from the inside out. When you begin to speak to yourself with clarity and compassion, you start to see life differently. You begin to react to setbacks with patience, to moments of uncertainty with curiosity rather than panic. You carry yourself as someone worthy of respect, not because others say so, but because your own voice declares it. And this changes not just how you feel, but how you act. You move with quiet confidence, not loud bravado. You take risks not out of desperation, but out of hope. You relate to others without needing their approval to steady your footing. The inner voice, then, is not just background noise. It is the script from which we perform, the soil from which belief and behavior grow. If it is harsh, the world becomes harsh. If it is kind, even difficulty becomes a teacher. Change the voice, and you change the lens. Change the lens, and you change everything. There is a quiet truth often overlooked in the rush of daily life. The words we speak within ourselves, even if never spoken aloud, hold immense power. We tend to reserve our awareness for external language, the things we say to others, the conversations we rehearse, the speeches we plan. But there is another kind of dialogue that shapes us far more deeply. The silent, persistent self-talk that hums beneath the surface of our thoughts. It may seem harmless because it is invisible, yet it leaves imprints just as real as any spoken word. The mind does not always distinguish between what is heard from the outside and what is echoed within. In this way, internal language becomes internal law. Imagine walking into a room where someone says, "You always mess things up." The sting is immediate, the tone lingers. Now, imagine saying the same thing to yourself, quietly, without witnesses. The feeling may not be as sharp at first, but it seeps in. And unlike external criticism, which fades with distance, internal criticism repeats. It loops. One cruel sentence, whispered over weeks or months, becomes a belief. This is how self-talk becomes self-programming, not through volume, but through repetition and emotional weight. The words might not be shouted, but they are carved slowly into the walls of the self. There is a strange kind of faith at work in our internal dialogues. We tend to believe our thoughts without testing them. A passing worry, "I probably fail this," is accepted as prophecy. A judgment, "I'm not good enough," is treated as fact. We rarely ask, "Is this true?" or "Would I say this to someone I care about?" Instead, we assume the voice within is a fair and accurate judge. But this voice, left unchecked, becomes a tyrant, and tyrants rarely speak truth. They speak control, doubt, and fear, dressed as certainty. The weight of words inside us is not simply emotional, it becomes physical, behavioral, relational. A person who constantly tells themselves they're a burden begins to move through life hesitantly, apologetically. Their shoulders round, their voice lowers, their presence shrinks. Not because the world demanded it, but because their inner language trained them to take up less space. In contrast, someone who speaks to themselves with encouragement, even quietly, walks with more steadiness. They take up space not arrogantly, but confidently, because their internal world supports their existence instead of undermining it. It is tempting to believe that only big, dramatic statements matter in self-talk. But the small phrases, the quiet mutterings, shape us more. "Of course this happened to me. Typical. What else is new?" These phrases seem harmless, even humorous, but they carry subtle conclusions. They imply that failure is expected, that joy is suspicious, that effort is futile. Over time, this quiet, cynical narration becomes the story we live by. On the other hand, a simple shift. "I'm learning. This is just a moment. I handled that the best I could," can reframe entire experiences without denying their difficulty. The words are gentle, but they are not weak. They are a defiance against the harshness we have internalized. We often think we need grand change to feel better, new jobs, new cities, new relationships, but sometimes what's needed first is a new way of speaking, especially when no one else is listening. The voice in your mind is the one you hear the most. What it says will either bind you or free you, not because it has magical power, but because it forms the lens through which you see, the filter through which you feel, and the script from which you act. If that voice is cruel, the world becomes cruel. If that voice is kind, even pain becomes bearable. And so, even in silence, words hold the weight of transformation. There is something quietly profound about the number 3. It is long enough to begin change, yet short enough to feel possible. 3 days, 72 hours, can seem like nothing at all, or like a lifetime, depending on how one spends them. In the context of self-talk, 3 days of conscious, deliberate attention can begin to interrupt patterns that have been playing for years. It is not that transformation occurs entirely in such a short time, but that the mind, when guided intentionally, even for a brief period, can begin to understand that a different way is possible. The power of 3 days lies in what happens when you finally become aware of the invisible. Most people are not fully conscious of the tone they use with themselves. They don't notice the subtle digs, the pessimistic refrains, the casual self-dismissals. These are automatic, like background music in a store you've visited so many times you've stopped hearing it. But when you pause and start to actually listen, really listen to what you say inside, it's like stepping out of the store and hearing silence for the first time. Suddenly the noise becomes clear. And this clarity alone is powerful. For 3 days, if you choose to hear yourself honestly, you will begin to realize what kind of relationship you've been keeping with your own mind. It's not about perfection. During these 3 days, you will likely still slip into old phrases. You will still catch yourself mid-thought, mid-judgment. But the catching is the point. The noticing is the work. Each time you become aware, you interrupt the pattern. Each interruption is a fracture in the wall the mind has built over years of repetition. You may not break it down entirely in 3 days, but you begin the process of weakening its hold. Awareness is not passive. It is a force of renewal. What happens when a person talks to themselves with intention, even for a short time, is that they begin to feel a subtle sense of agency returning. Words like, "I always mess this up," become, "I've done this before, but I'm learning." Phrases like, "I'm such an idiot," become, "That was a mistake, but it doesn't define me." These may seem like small changes, but they shift the emotional current. Instead of dragging yourself through shame, you begin to walk with yourself through understanding. And even if your outer circumstances remain the same, your inner environment becomes more livable. 3 days of this, 3 days of treating your inner world as something sacred rather than disposable, can restore parts of you that have gone quiet, the parts that once dreamed, that once tried, that once believed. When the mind is no longer a hostile place, the heart begins to speak again. New thoughts rise, possibilities feel less distant. The simple act of speaking differently to yourself makes space for things to grow. Encouragement, creativity, hope. They do not flourish in harsh soil. But 3 days of kindness can begin to soften the ground. And though it is only 3 days, the mind remembers. It remembers how it felt to be spoken to gently. It begins to crave it. Like the body after water in a desert, the spirit leans into compassion once it has tasted it. You will find that even when you are tempted to revert, something within resists. Not out of willpower, but out of recognition. This is not how I want to live anymore. The shift does not require loud declarations or dramatic gestures. It requires presence. A steady, quiet attentiveness. It requires a willingness to listen. to rephrase, to stay with yourself in the discomfort of undoing old narratives. And in just 3 days, you will begin to see that what once felt fixed can in fact begin to bend. There is a peculiar kind of double standard many people live with, one where compassion is generously offered to others but withheld from the self. A friend makes a mistake, and we reassure them. They doubt themselves, and we encourage. They fall, and we help them up with soft words and patient understanding. Yet when we stumble in similar ways, the response from within is often sharp, impatient, and unforgiving. The voice we reserve for ourselves is rarely as gentle as the one we give to those we love. This quiet cruelty goes unnoticed because it's private, but it leaves deep impressions all the same. To talk to yourself as you would a friend is not merely a sentiment of self-care. It is a radical act of rehumanizing the self. It means recognizing that you too are worthy of empathy, not because you have proven yourself or succeeded in every way, but because you are human and trying. It means remembering that the same softness that heals others can also heal you. We are often told to be strong, to push through, to toughen up. But strength does not have to wear the face of harshness. Sometimes strength is found in the gentle tone we use with ourselves when we're tempted to tear down what's already bruised. When you begin to speak to yourself as a friend would, the entire rhythm of your inner world changes. Instead of berating yourself for feeling tired, you say, "Of course you're tired. You've been carrying a lot." Instead of snapping at yourself for not meeting every expectation, you say, "You're doing the best you can with what you have right now." These aren't excuses. They are acknowledgements of humanity. They are bridges built between the mind and the heart, allowing them to walk together instead of pulling in opposite directions. A friend doesn't expect perfection before offering love. A friend doesn't withdraw kindness because you've failed. That kind of acceptance, when offered to yourself, begins to undo years of internal conditionality. The idea that you are only worthy of grace when everything is going well. It dismantles the lie that you must earn your own compassion. If you've ever told someone you're being too hard on yourself, consider that the same might be true for you more often than you realize. The voice of a friend says, "It's okay to be where you are. Let's move forward together." That is the voice you must learn to echo inward. The effect of this shift in self-talk ripples outward. When you speak to yourself as a friend, you no longer relate to others from a place of comparison or silent desperation. You become more grounded, less performative, more whole. You aren't using other people to prove or disprove your worth because you've already granted it to yourself. This allows for deeper connection, genuine presence, and less fear of being seen in your imperfection. There is something deeply healing about being on your own side. Not blindly, not in denial of flaws or failures, but in the same way you would stand beside someone you care about. You hold yourself accountable, but not cruelly. You acknowledge pain, but you don't belittle it. You strive for more, but you're not using shame as the motivator. This is not about self-indulgence. It's about fairness. It's about finally recognizing that you too deserve to be spoken to with the kind of respect that builds rather than breaks. To make this change is to step into a new kind of inner relationship. One where you no longer have to fear your own voice. Where the silence inside you becomes a place of safety rather than judgment. Where, no matter what the world demands or denies, you know that at least one person, yourself, is committed to seeing you with kindness. Imagination is one of the most powerful forces within the human mind. It creates before anything exists, envisions what cannot yet be seen, and shapes meaning out of chaos. But left unguarded, it can become a tormentor instead of a teacher. The mind will believe what it is told repeatedly, especially when those messages come clothed in emotion. And so, if fear is the voice that commands the imagination, it will build scenes of failure, rejection, disaster. If doubt becomes the narrator, the imagination will furnish every moment with evidence of inadequacy. The danger here is not only in what is imagined, but in how much authority we give those images. A person might make one mistake and, in their imagination, it becomes a lifetime of failure. They are not just someone who stumbled. They are now the one who always ruins things. Another may face an uncertain moment and immediately envision everything going wrong, not because there is proof, but because their imagination is working against them rather than with them. The mind in these moments begins to discipline the person. It becomes the accuser, the punisher, the relentless prophet of doom. It says, "This is who you are, and this is how it will end." Not because these things are true, but because they are repeated often enough to feel true. Yet this same imagination, when disciplined with truth, becomes a source of resilience and creativity. Discipline, in this sense, does not mean suppression, it means guidance. It means choosing what you feed it and what you allow it to echo. If a person wakes each morning and tells themselves, "Today will be a mess," the mind begins looking for evidence to support that prediction. If they say instead, "Today is a chance, even if it's imperfect," the mind scans the day differently. The events may be the same, but the story changes. The story shapes emotion, and emotion drives behavior. This is why inner speech matters so deeply. The words you say to yourself aren't just thoughts, they are permissions. They give the imagination instructions. A harsh phrase like, "You always fail," becomes a command, and the imagination obeys by showing you scenes from the past where you failed and future scenarios where you might fail again. The more you watch these imagined failures, the more hesitant you become to try. The more you hesitate, the more you prove the fear right. It becomes a self-fulfilling loop, all started by one unchallenged sentence. To reverse this pattern, the imagination must be invited to serve a different master. Instead of fear, it must be directed by clarity, honesty, and hope. This does not mean pretending everything is perfect or forcing unrealistic beliefs. It means deliberately speaking words that are aligned with growth rather than defeat. When you say, "I can try again," the imagination gets to work, not just picturing success, but creating the mental space for problem solving, adaptation, and courage. The brain begins to rehearse perseverance instead of collapse. One of the most overlooked truths is that the imagination listens. It listens to what you repeat. It listens to the words you mutter under your breath when no one else is around. If you speak with self-contempt, it builds images of isolation. If you speak with curiosity and care, it begins to show you possibilities. You cannot always stop the first fearful thought, but you can stop giving it the final word. You can learn to question it, redirect it, replace it, and in doing so, you reclaim the power to shape the narrative inside your own mind. The imagination will work regardless of whether you pay attention to it or not. But when you learn to speak with purpose, to direct your inner language, you transform it from a tyrant into a tool. You stop living under its weight and begin walking with it as a companion. Not because you silence fear entirely, but because you no longer let it speak alone. The words we speak to ourselves do not vanish once uttered internally. They remain, quietly working beneath the surface. Every thought repeated becomes a thread, and with enough threads, a pattern forms. Over time, this pattern weaves itself into the fabric of identity. We begin to believe not only what we think, but that we are what we think. A person who repeatedly tells themselves, "I'm not good at anything," doesn't just believe they lack skill, they begin to see their entire self through that lens. Identity is shaped not by a single moment, but by many moments of repeated speech, each whisper echoing into the next until it becomes the dominant narrative. This is the unnoticed weight we carry. A person might say, "I've always been anxious," or "I've never been good with people," without realizing they are not stating facts. They are repeating stories that were built from internal repetition. These statements may feel like truths, but they are often the result of unchecked thoughts, hardened into self-concepts. The repetition of thought becomes belief, and belief becomes identity. What was once a passing feeling becomes a permanent label simply because it was repeated, unquestioned, for too long. What makes this process even more powerful is that the mind, once it accepts a belief as part of the identity, begins filtering every experience through it. If someone sees themselves as a failure, they will overlook or dismiss moments of success as flukes. If they believe they are not worthy of love, they will doubt the sincerity of kindness shown to them. The belief colors the perception. Reality becomes distorted, not by external forces, but by the lens created through internal speech. This is why changing your internal language isn't just about motivation or temporary encouragement. It is about reshaping the very way you relate to yourself. When you begin to speak differently inside, to replace self-rejection with self-cognition, to question shame and invite truth, you start to reweave the pattern. Identity begins to shift, not through force, but through consistent presence. You are not telling yourself a lie to feel better. You are undoing a lie that has been accepted for too long. Consider someone who has long believed they are lazy. Perhaps this began in childhood, when they were compared to others, or when they struggled in school. Over time, they adopted the label and repeated it. "I'm just not motivated." That phrase, spoken again and again, begins to direct behavior. They stop trying in areas they once enjoyed. They don't attempt new things because the identity has already declared the outcome. But when they begin to speak differently, perhaps something simple like, "I'm learning how to manage my energy," or "I'm still figuring out my rhythm," the belief loosens. There is space now for a new identity to emerge, one not rooted in condemnation, but in growth. The shift is not immediate, but repetition works both ways. Just as harmful language can entrench false identities, intentional language can nurture true ones. With time, the mind begins to believe what it hears most often, and when those words reflect possibility, patience, and effort, identity follows. You begin to see yourself not as a fixed character, but as someone evolving, someone capable, someone becoming. This is why inner speech must be guarded, not with fear, but with care. Words are not just passing thoughts, they are seeds. Left unmonitored, they grow wild, but with attention and intention, they can be planted well. You can cultivate an identity rooted in truth rather than trauma, in hope rather than habit. What you repeat to yourself you become, and what you become shapes how you move through the world, not as someone limited by an old story, but as someone free to write a new one. So then, what are we truly doing when we talk to ourselves? We are not merely thinking, we are building. We are laying the foundation for the person we believe ourselves to be. Every word repeated inwardly becomes a brick in that structure. And for far too long, many have built houses of shame, rooms filled with doubt, and doors locked by fear, all with the quiet murmur of inner criticism. But for just 3 days, if we speak with intention, if we offer ourselves the tone of a friend, if we notice and redirect the language of defeat, if we guard the imagination and plant new seeds of self-recognition, we begin to alter not just how we feel, but who we are. Not by pretending the struggle isn't real, but by refusing to let that struggle be the only voice in the room. You do not need to become someone else to change. You need only speak differently to the one you already are. Speak with mercy, speak with patience, speak with hope. Let the words inside you no longer be the weight you carry, the wings you grow. For the voice you use when no one is listening, that is the voice that becomes your life. So let it speak like someone worth listening to.